Chapter 1, The Auction of Souls. The air in the private viewing room of the Blackwood Gallery felt like it was being sucked out by a vacuum. Ivy St. Clair stood with her back against the cold velvet wallpaper, her knuckles white as she gripped her clutch. In front of her sat a man who had spent the last decade systematically dismantling her father's shipping empire, Julian Vane. At 34, Julian was the apex predator of Wall Street. He didn't just win, he erased his competition. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, his tailored charcoal suit molding to his powerful frame, his eyes the color of a winter sea, beautiful, deep, and capable of drowning anyone who got too close. "Your father's debt isn't just a number anymore, Ivy," Julian said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that sent a shiver of suspense down her spine. "It's a death sentence. $20 million in unsecured loans, plus the interest on his creative accounting. The feds are at his door. By morning, the St. Clair name will be synonymous with a jail cell." Ivy's father, Arthur, stood in the corner, a broken man trembling in his shadows. He looked at his daughter with a tragic mix of shame and desperation. "Julian, please," Arthur whispered. "There has to be another way." Julian stood up, his presence filling the room with a captivating and oppressive gravity. He ignored Arthur entirely, his gaze locking onto Ivy. He walked toward her until the heat from his body was the only thing she could feel. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a touch that was both a caress and a claim. "There is," Julian said, his eyes darkening. "I'll buy the debt. I'll make the investigations vanish. I'll even infuse your father's shell companies with enough capital to keep him in his mansion." "And the price?" Ivy asked, her voice steady despite the conflict roaring in her heart. Julian leaned down, his lips inches from hers. "The price is you. A 3-year marriage contract. You move into my estate. You play the role of the devoted wife. You belong to the man your father tried to destroy." The hook was set. Ivy looked at the bill of sale on the table, a marriage license that felt more like a prison sentence. To save her father from a life behind bars, she had to become the ultimate trophy for his greatest rival. "Why me, Julian?" she breathed. "You hate my family." "I do," he whispered, his grip on her chin tightening just a fraction. "And there is no better way to finish a war than to take the enemy's most precious treasure for myself. Sign the paper, Ivy. Or watch your father fall." Ivy took the pen. The auction of souls was over. As she signed her name, Julian didn't smile, he simply took her hand and led her toward the door. She wasn't just a bride. She was a settled debt, traded to a ruthless billionaire, who intended to collect every bit of interest she owed. Chapter 2, The Lion's Den. The Vane estate was not a home, it was a monument to absolute control. Situated on a jagged cliff overlooking the crashing waves of the Atlantic, the structure was a masterpiece of cold glass and black basalt. As the iron gates hissed shut behind Julian's obsidian-colored SUV, Ivy felt the finality of the sound settle in her marrow. She was no longer a St. Clair, she was an acquisition. "Your belongings have already been moved to the East Wing," Julian said, his voice cutting through the silence of the marble foyer. He didn't look at her as he handed his coat to a silent, stone-faced butler. "In this house, we live by a schedule. Breakfast is at 6. I expect you to be dressed for the day. My life is a series of calculated moves, and you are now the most visible move I have." Ivy stood her ground, her heels echoing like a heartbeat against the polished floor. "You bought my debt, Julian, not my autonomy. I'm not a doll you can wind up and set at a table." Julian stopped, turning slowly. The ruthless energy he projected was almost a physical weight. He walked back to her, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You are exactly what the contract says you are. A partner in name, a subordinate in practice. Rule number 1. You do not leave this estate without my security detail. Rule number 2. You do not speak to your father unless I am on the line. And rule number 3. He stepped into her personal space, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes with a conflicting intensity. You do not enter my private study. Ever. Some debts are paid in public, Ivy, but the reasons I took you stay behind closed doors. The unique tragedy of the situation became clear as Ivy explored her new quarters. Her room was palatial, filled with silk and gold, but it lacked a single personal touch. It was a gilded cage. When she tried to open the French doors leading to the balcony, she found they were reinforced with a high-tech locking system. She wasn't just a wife, she was a high-value prisoner. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ivy wandered into the kitchen for water. She found Julian there, but he wasn't the shark-like billionaire. He was standing by the window, staring out at the dark ocean, his hand clutching a glass of amber liquid so hard his knuckles were white. He looked tragic, haunted by a ghost she couldn't see. "What did my father really do to you?" Ivy asked, her voice a soft bridge in the dark. Julian didn't turn. "He didn't just steal money, Ivy. He stole a future. He thinks this debt is about the shipping lanes. He has no idea that I've been waiting 15 years to see a St. Clair look as broken as I felt. And am I broken enough for you yet?" Julian finally turned, his eyes flashing with a captivating and dangerous heat. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, pinning her against the cold marble counter. For a moment, the suspense was suffocating. He leaned in, his scent of sandalwood and expensive scotch surrounding her. "Not yet," he whispered, his voice a low vibration against her skin. "But the night is young, and the contract is long." The chapter ends with Julian pulling away and leaving her alone in the dark kitchen. Ivy realized then that the debt wasn't just about her father's business, it was about a deep, unique wound in Julian's past, and she was the only one close enough to feel the jagged edges of his pain. Chapter 3, Sins of the Father. The third day in the Vane estate felt like living inside a beautiful clock, precise, ticking, and utterly heartless. Julian was gone before the sun cleared the horizon, leaving behind a list of social engagements and a wardrobe of designer dresses that felt more like a costume than a choice. But Ivy wasn't a woman who sat still in a cage. While the security detail was occupied with a shift change, she slipped into the massive, 2-story library. She wasn't looking for a book, she was looking for a motive. The tragic intensity in Julian's eyes the night before suggested that her father's crimes went far deeper than a few millions in bad debt. After an hour of searching, she found it. Hidden behind a row of leather-bound law journals was a plain, unmarked gray folder. Inside were old newspaper clippings from 20 years ago, headlines that made her blood run cold. St. Clair Shipping found guilty in dock fire, local worker blamed for negligent deaths. Beneath the clippings was a photograph of a young, dirt-smudged boy standing outside a burning tenement house. Even through the grain of the old film, the eyes were unmistakable. They were Julian's. The conflict hit her with the force of a tidal wave. Her father hadn't just outmaneuvered a rival, he had covered up a disaster that killed Julian's parents and branded his father a criminal. Julian wasn't just a ruthless billionaire who wanted her family's money. He was an orphan who had spent 20 years clawing his way out of the ashes of a lie her father had built. Fascinating, isn't it? Ivy gasped, dropping the folder. Julian was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh midday sun. He didn't look angry, he looked hollow. "You found the sins of the father," he said, walking into the room. He didn't yell. His calm was far more terrifying. He picked up the photo of the young boy and looked at it with a detached, clinical pity. Your father didn't just steal my childhood, Ivy. He stole my name. He let the world believe my father was a drunk who fell asleep with a cigarette, rather than admitting the St. Clair docks had faulty wiring. Julian, I didn't know, Ivy whispered, her voice cracking with captivating guilt. Of course you didn't, Julian snapped, the mask finally slipping to reveal a unique and burning rage. You were the princess of the shipping lanes. You were off at boarding school while I was eating in soup kitchens and changing my name so no one would know I was the son of a murderer. Do you understand now? This isn't a debt marriage. This is a repayment. For every night I went hungry, you will spend a night in this house knowing you belong to the son of the man your father destroyed. The suspense reached a fever pitch as Julian stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her. He reached out and touched this St. Clair crest on the necklace she wore, a family heirloom. With a sharp tug, the gold chain snapped. Don't wear that in my house again, he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. But as he turned to leave, Ivy saw it, the fracture in his armor. His hand was shaking. He didn't just want revenge, he wanted the pain to stop, and he was realizing that owning her wasn't making him feel any more whole. The chapter ends with Ivy standing in the middle of the library, the broken necklace at her feet. She realized the ruthless man she was married to was actually a victim, and the father she was trying to save was a villain. She was caught in a conflicting war where there were no heroes, only the tragic remains of a 20-year-old fire. Chapter 4, The First Fracture. The atmosphere in the house shifted from a Cold War to a high-stakes drama at precisely 3 a.m. A frantic call from the medical facility where Arthur St. Clair was being held under house arrest shattered the silence of the Vane estate. Arthur had suffered a severe cardiac event. Ivy was at the top of the grand staircase, her face a mask of tragic terror, when Julian emerged from his wing. He was already on the phone, his voice sharp and authoritative, giving orders to a team of private cardiologists. Julian, please, Ivy begged, her voice a raw whisper of conflict. I have to go to him. The contract says I'm not allowed to leave without you, so take me. Please. Julian looked at her. For a long, agonizing second, the ruthless billionaire calculated the cost. If Arthur died tonight, the debt was settled in the most permanent way possible. His revenge would be complete. But as he looked at Ivy, shaking, vulnerable, and looking at him with a glimmer of fascinating hope, his jaw tightened. Get in the car, he said, his voice a low growl. The drive to the hospital was a masterclass in suspense. Rain lashed against the windows of the SUV as Julian drove with a reckless, focused intensity. He didn't speak, but his hand stayed white-knuckled on the gear shift. When they arrived, the reality of the sins of the father became realistic and painful. Arthur lay in a bed, hooked to a dozen machines, looking small and fragile. Ivy rushed to his side, clutching his hand and weeping. Julian stayed in the doorway. He watched the man who had ruined his life, the man he had hated for 2 decades, struggling for every breath. This was the moment he had dreamed of, Arthur St. Clair at his mercy. But the unique twist was that seeing Arthur like this didn't bring Julian joy. It brought him a sickening sense of emptiness. Suddenly, Arthur's monitor began to wail. A nurse rushed in, shouting for the crash cart. Out! Everyone out, the doctor commanded. Ivy was being pushed back, her eyes wide with captivating panic, when she felt a pair of strong, steady arms wrap around her from behind. Julian didn't pull her toward the exit, he pulled her against his chest, shielding her from the sight of the doctors working on her father. Look at me, Ivy, Julian commanded, his voice vibrating against her ear. Don't look at the bed. Look at me. For the first time, the glacier didn't just crack, it shattered. In the sterile, fluorescent light of the hospital hallway, Julian held her with a softness that wasn't in the contract. He wasn't the debt collector, he was a man who knew exactly what it felt like to lose a parent, and he couldn't bring himself to let her feel that same void. "You hate him," Ivy sobbed into his shoulder. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you're not him," Julian whispered, his hand sliding up to cradle the back of her head. "And because I'm tired of being the only one who remembers the fire." The chapter ends with the doctor stepping out, his face grave. Arthur was stable, but the first fracture in Julian's heart was permanent. He had chosen Ivy's peace over his own revenge, and as they stood in the quiet hallway, the debt between them felt less like a cage and more like a shared, tragic bond. Chapter 5: The Public Charade. The hospital room had been a sanctuary of raw truth, but the real world demanded the return of the masks. 2 weeks after Arthur's heart attack, the Vane St. Clair Union had to be presented to the elite of Manhattan at the annual Winter Solstice Gala. This was the public charade, a high-stakes game where one slip of the tongue could invite the sharks to a feeding frenzy. In the master suite of the Vane estate, Julian stood behind Ivy, watching her reflection in the triple-mirrored vanity. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, but her expression was one of conflicting anxiety. "The press is going to look for blood, Ivy," Julian said, his voice a low, steady anchor. He reached into a velvet box and pulled out a necklace. It wasn't the St. Clair crest he had broken, it was a stunning, modern piece of raw sapphires and white gold. "They expect me to be the conqueror and you to be the prize. If we don't look like we're in love, they'll start digging into the debt merger." As he fastened the cold gems around her neck, his fingers lingered against the warmth of her skin. The suspense in the room was electric. They were closer than they had ever been, yet the ruthless billionaire was back in his tuxedo armor. "Why do you care what they think?" Ivy asked, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "You already have the company. You already have me." "Because a reputation is like glass," Julian whispered, leaning down so his reflection stood over hers. "Hard to break, but once it's cracked, everyone can see the flaws. Tonight, we are the golden couple. Do you understand?" When they entered the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, the flashbulbs were a physical assault. Julian didn't flinch. He tucked Ivy into his side, his arm a possessive and protective weight around her waist. To the world, it looked like a captivating romance. To Ivy, it felt like being held by a beautiful, dangerous statue. The conflict arrived in the form of Sloane Sterling, a rival socialite who had once hoped to secure Julian for herself. She glided toward them with a smile that was as sharp as a razor. "Julian, darling." "And the little St. Clair girl," Sloane purred, her eyes raking over Ivy. "How charitable of you to take her in after her father's unfortunate collapse. I hear the St. Clair estate is being liquidated as we speak. Must be so unique to live in the home of the man who bankrupted your family, Ivy." Ivy felt the sting of the tragic, public humiliation, but before she could speak, Julian tightened his grip. "Liquidation is a business term, Sloane," Julian said, his voice dropping into a ruthless chill that silenced the surrounding guests. "I prefer to think of it as a consolidation of assets. And as for Ivy, she isn't living in my home. She is the mistress of it. Anything that belongs to me is hers. Including my temper if you continue this line of questioning." The twist was the absolute silence that followed. Julian hadn't just offended her, he had claimed her in a way that felt realistic and terrifyingly permanent. As the music swelled for the first dance, Julian led Ivy to the center of the floor. Under the gaze of 1,000 eyes, he pulled her close, closer than the charade required. Their bodies moved in a fascinating sync, a dance of two people who were supposed to hate each other but were currently sharing the same breath. "You didn't have to do that," Ivy whispered against the lapel of his tuxedo. "I don't like people touching what's mine," Julian replied, but as he spun her, his hand slid up to the small of her back, and for a split second, he closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. The dance finishing to thunderous applause. They had won the night, but as they walked off the floor, Ivy realized the public charade was becoming dangerously close to a private reality. The debt was being paid in public, but the interest was being collected in the quiet, conflicting beats of her own heart. Chapter 6: The Unspoken Protector. The high of the gala was short-lived. The public charade had convinced the elite, but it had also signaled to the shadows that Ivy was Julian's greatest vulnerability. The realistic danger didn't come from a boardroom, but from the desperate remnants of her father's past. 2 nights after the gala, Julian was stuck in an emergency meeting in the city. Ivy, feeling the gilded cage closing in, decided to walk the estate's cliffside trail within the perimeter. She thought she was safe. She didn't know that Dominic Rossi, a former fixer for her father who had lost millions when Julian called in the debt, had been watching the gates. The attack was unique in its clinical silence. 2 men stepped from the shadows of the pine trees. Before Ivy could scream, a heavy hand was over her mouth. "Your father owes me more than a shipping line, Princess," Rossi's voice hissed in her ear. "If Julian Vane wants his trophy back, he's going to pay the interest your father skipped." The suspense was a cold blade against her neck as they dragged her toward a concealed service entrance. But Rossi had underestimated one thing. Julian Vane didn't just own a security detail, he was the security detail. Julian had returned early, his intuition, that captivating sixth sense that made him a billionaire, screaming that something was wrong. He didn't call the police, he didn't have time. He found the struggle near the trail, his heart doing something it hadn't done in 15 years, it panicked. The conflict was violent and brief. Julian emerged from the dark like a ruthless wraith. He didn't use a weapon. He used the raw, unadulterated fury of a man whose hidden softness had been threatened. He took down the first man with a brutal efficiency that spoke of a childhood spent on the docks, not in a penthouse. When Rossi turned, using Ivy as a shield, Julian stopped. His eyes weren't the cold blue of the ocean anymore, they were the black of the abyss. "Let her go, Dominic," Julian said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "And I might let you live long enough to see the inside of a cell. Touch her again, and there won't be enough of you left for a funeral." Rossi laughed, a tragic sound of a man with nothing to lose. "You love her, don't you, Vane? The great shark has a heart after all." The twist came when Ivy, seeing Julian's eyes soften with a split second of fascinating fear for her, realized she wasn't a victim. She drove her elbow into Rossi's ribs and bit down on his hand. As he yelped and loosened his grip, Julian moved. It was a blur of motion. Rossi was on the ground, and Julian was over him, his fist raised in a captivating display of protective rage. "Julian, stop!" Ivy screamed, throwing herself onto his back, her arms wrapping around his neck. "Stop! You've got him. Don't become what they say you are." Julian froze, his chest heaving. He looked at the man on the ground, then he felt the warmth of Ivy against him, the girl who was supposed to be his enemy, now acting as his conscience. He slowly opened his hand and stood up, pulling Ivy into his arms with a strength that was almost painful. "I've got you," he whispered into her hair, his voice shaking. "I've got you." The unspoken protector had revealed himself. As the estate security finally arrived to haul Rossi away, Julian didn't let Ivy go. He carried her back to the house, ignoring the blood on his knuckles and the conflicting reality of his emotions. The chapter ends with them in the library, the site of so much past pain. Julian was cleaning a scrape on Ivy's cheek with a tenderness that wasn't in the contract. "The debt is paid, Ivy," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You're not a prisoner anymore. You can go. I'll settle the feds, and you can take your father and disappear." Ivy looked at the man who had just risked his life for her. "And if I don't want to go?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Julian's hand stopped. He looked at her, the ruthless billionaire, finally, completely unmasked, and for the first time, Ivy saw not a rival, but a partner. Chapter 7, A Night of Truth. The offer of freedom hung in the air like a ghost, but the Atlantic had other plans. As if the heavens were mirroring the conflicting storm inside the estate, a nor'easter slammed into the coast. The power grid, usually invincible, succumbed to a fallen oak, plunging the basalt fortress into a thick, velvet darkness. The backup generators hummed but failed to power the sprawling wings, forcing Julian and Ivy into the only room with a functional stone fireplace, Julian's master suite. The realistic tension was palpable. The room was a sanctuary of dark wood and charcoal silks, smelling of cedar and Julian's signature sandalwood. In the flickering amber light of the hearth, the ruthless billionaire looked stripped of his corporate armor. He sat on the edge of the hearth, poking at the embers, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. "I meant what I said, Ivy," Julian murmured, the firelight dancing in his captivating blue eyes. "The security breach tonight changed things. I realize that keeping you here to settle a score is putting you in a crosshair you don't deserve. The contract is just paper. I'll have my lawyers dissolve it by morning." Ivy sat on the plush rug a few feet away, her heart hammering a fascinating rhythm against her ribs. "You spent 15 years planning this, Julian. You dismantled my life brick by brick. Why stop now when you finally have everything?" Julian dropped the poker. The clang echoed through the silent room. He turned to her, his expression tragic and raw. "Because having everything feels a lot like having nothing if I have to watch you look at me with fear every time I walk into a room. I wanted to break your father. I didn't realize that by breaking him, I was shattering the only person who actually looked at me like I was a man, and not a monster." The unique truth spilled out in the shadows. Julian confessed that he had watched her for years, not just as a target, but as a beacon. He had seen her charity work, her kindness to the dockworkers, and her quiet strength. He had hated her for being the good part of a family he despised. "I didn't buy the debt to destroy you, Ivy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I bought it because I was selfish. I wanted to see if the girl who smelled like jasmine and sunshine could survive in my world of ice. I wanted to see if you could save me." The suspense broke as Ivy reached out, her fingers grazing his bruised knuckles. The ones he had used to protect her. "You didn't have to buy me to get me to stay, Julian. You just had to ask." The twist was the shift in power. The debt marriage was no longer about money or revenge, it was about two lonely souls finding a bridge in the middle of a war. Julian leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the cold air. The physical conflict dissolved into a deep, captivating connection that no contract could ever regulate. "Ask me," Ivy breathed. Julian's hands, usually so steady and commanding, trembled as he cupped her face. "Stay. Not because of the debt. Not because of your father. Stay because the house is too quiet when you're not here. Stay because I don't know how to be a human being without you." As the storm raged outside, shaking the very foundations of the cliffside estate, a different kind of fire ignited between them. It wasn't the ruthless claim of a rival, but the desperate, realistic hunger of a man who had finally found home. The chapter ends with the two of them wrapped in a single blanket by the dying fire, the night of truth having burned away the lies of the past. But as the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, a new suspense loomed. The world still thought they were enemies, and the people who wanted Julian's crown were about to use Ivy as the ultimate weapon. Chapter 8. The Shadow of the Rivalry. The morning after the storm brought a deceptive peace. The sun glittered off the wet basalt rocks, and for a few hours, the night of truth felt like a new beginning. But the realistic world of old blood and deep debts was not finished with Ivy St. Clair. A black sedan arrived at the estate gates at noon. It wasn't the police or Julian's lawyers. It was Arthur St. Clair, looking remarkably recovered and wearing a suit that cost more than most people's annual salary. He didn't look like the tragic man Ivy had wept over in the hospital. He looked like the shark who had once ruled the Atlantic shipping lanes. Julian met him in the grand foyer, his hand instinctively finding the small of Ivy's back. The conflict was immediate and electric. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice a ruthless chill. "You're off your feet sooner than expected. I assume you're here to thank me for saving your life, and your daughter's." "I'm here to settle the score, Vane," Arthur said, his eyes hard and unique in their lack of gratitude. He pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger from his briefcase and tossed it onto the marble table. "I found it. The Cayman's account your father thought he'd hidden from me 20 years ago. It's been sitting there, accruing interest, waiting for me to remember the password." Ivy felt a cold pit form in her stomach. "Father, what are you doing?" "I'm buying you back, Ivy," Arthur said, a triumphant, captivating smirk on his face. "There's 30 million in that account. More than enough to pay off the debt, the interest, and a penalty for the way this animal has treated you. The marriage is over. We're leaving." The twist was a jagged blade. The money in that account wasn't just savings, it was the sins of the father, in physical form. It was the money Arthur had skimmed from the dockworkers' pension funds, the very funds that should have gone to the families of the fire victims, including Julian's. Julian stared at the ledger. He didn't look at the money, he looked at Ivy. The suspense was suffocating. He saw her face go pale as she realized the source of the wealth. "You didn't find that account, Arthur," Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of fury. "You've had it all along. You let me buy your daughter. You let me hold her in this house like a prisoner while you sat on the blood money that killed my parents. You used your own child as a human shield while you waited for the market to turn. It was a business move." Arthur shouted. "And now I'm making a move to get her back." Arthur turned to Ivy, reaching for her arm. "Come on, Ivy. The car is waiting. Let's leave this monster to his empty house." This was the shadow of the rivalry at its darkest. Ivy looked at her father. The man she had sacrificed her freedom for, and saw a stranger. Then she looked at Julian, the ruthless billionaire, who had protected her, cried with her, and offered her freedom for nothing in return. "No," Ivy said, her voice small but realistic in its steel. She stepped back, away from her father, and stood firmly beside Julian. "What?" Arthur gaped. "Ivy, I'm saving you." "You're not saving me, father. You're trying to buy me for the second time," Ivy said, tears of tragic realization blurring her vision. "Julian gave me the choice to leave this morning. He offered me my life back for free. You only want me back because you found a way to win the game. I'm not a trophy, and I'm not a debt. I'm staying." The chapter ends with Arthur being escorted out by security, his face twisted in a conflicting mask of rage and defeat. But the victory felt like ashes. Julian turned to Ivy, his face unreadable. "He'll go to the press now," Julian whispered. "He'll tell them I coerced you. He'll show them the contract to save his own skin." The suspense was no longer about the marriage, it was about the total destruction of their reputations. They had chosen each other, but the world was about to demand a price they weren't sure they could pay. Chapter 9, The Betrayal. The morning after Arthur's departure felt like the breathless pause before a hanging. The realistic consequences of defying a man like Arthur St. Clair didn't take long to manifest. By 8 a.m., the Vane estate was no longer a fortress, it was a fishbowl. A push notification chimed on Ivy's phone, then Julian's, then the house staff's. The headline on the National Financial Insider was unique in its cruelty. Bought and bound, the secret debt contract of Julian Vane's slave bride. The article was a masterpiece of tragic distortion. It featured a leaked scan of the original marriage contract, but the clauses were heavily redacted to make Julian look like a monster. It painted a picture of a ruthless billionaire who had used predatory loans to blackmail a grieving daughter into a 3-year term of personal service. Sloane Sterling had done her job well. She had combined Arthur's insider knowledge with her own media connections to create a narrative that Ivy was a victim of human trafficking in a tuxedo. "They're calling for my arrest," Julian said, his voice flat as he watched the news helicopters begin to circle the estate. He was standing in the kitchen, but the captivating fire in his eyes had been replaced by a dull, cold slate. "The board of Vane Global is meeting in an hour to strip my chairmanship. My parents' legacy, everything I built to spite your father, it's going to burn just like that tenement did." The betrayal wasn't just about the media. It was about the conflict of perception. Ivy looked at the comments scrolling beneath the article. The world was rescuing her, but they were doing it by destroying the only man who had ever truly seen her. "We have to tell them the truth, Julian," Ivy said, her voice trembling with suspense. "We have to show them the full contract. We have to tell them about the fire, the pension funds, and the choice you gave me." "No," Julian snapped, turning to her. "If you do that, your father goes to federal prison for the rest of his life. The feds will seize that Cayman's account, and you'll be left with nothing. No name, no money, no home." "I don't care about the money, Julian. I care about you." The twist arrived when the front gates were breached, not by the press, but by a fleet of black government SUVs. The SEC and the FBI had arrived to execute a search warrant based on the evidence of coercion. In the middle of the chaos, as agents began to swarm the basalt foyer, Julian did something unique. He didn't call his lawyers. He walked over to Ivy, took her hand, and pulled her into the quiet space beneath the grand staircase. "Rule number 4, Ivy," he whispered, his thumb brushing over her knuckles one last time. "When the ship is sinking, the captain stays behind so the passengers can live. I'm going to tell them the contract was my idea alone. I'm going to tell them I coerced you. You're going to be the victim the world wants you to be. I won't lie for you, Julian." "You're not lying for me," he said, a tragic smile touching his lips. "You're living for me." Before she could protest, Julian stepped out into the foyer, his hands raised. He didn't look like a criminal, he looked like a man who was finally paying the last of a debt he never owed. "I am Julian Vane," he announced to the lead agent, his voice a captivating roar that silenced the room. The St. Clair woman had no part in the structuring of the loans. "I am the sole architect of the agreement." The chapter ends with the click of handcuffs echoing through the marble hall. Ivy watched, her heart breaking in a conflicting scream of silence, as the man she loved was led away in the back of a government car, leaving her alone in the massive, cold house, the victim of a man who had just sacrificed his entire universe to keep her from falling. Chapter 10, The Climax, The Final Reckoning. The silence of the Vane estate after Julian's arrest was not peaceful, it was a tragic vacuum. Ivy stood in the foyer, staring at the spot where the man who had become her world had been led away in chains. She knew Julian was playing the martyr to protect her from her father's crimes, but she refused to let the ruthless billionaire drown in a sea of lies. "He thinks he's saving me," Ivy whispered to the empty room, her eyes hardening with a realistic resolve. "But I'm the only one who can save him." The climax began not with a lawyer, but with a hunt. Ivy knew her father. Arthur St. Clair wouldn't stay in the city to watch the fallout. He would be at the old St. Clair hunting lodge in the Catskills, waiting for the dust to settle so he could disappear with his Cayman millions. Driving Julian's backup SUV through a blinding rainstorm, Ivy pushed the vehicle to its limits. The suspense was a physical weight. She reached the lodge at midnight, the rustic wood cabin looking like a unique tomb in the dark. She burst through the door, finding Arthur sitting by a roaring fire, a glass of cognac in his hand and a flight itinerary on the table. "Ivy," he said, his voice smooth and conflicting in its warmth. "You're just in time. The private jet leaves in 4 hours. We're going to Switzerland. Vane is finished, the world hates him. We can finally start over." "The only thing that's finished is your lies, Father," Ivy said, stepping into the firelight. She wasn't the princess anymore. She was the woman who had survived the lion's Denver. "I'm not going to Switzerland. And neither are you." "Don't be dramatic," Arthur snapped. "I did this for us. You did this for you." Ivy shouted, her voice a captivating roar. She pulled her phone from her pocket. "I've been recording since I walked in. I want you to tell the truth. About the dock fire. About the pension funds. And about how you leaked the contract to Sloane Sterling." The twist was Arthur's reaction. He didn't crumble, he laughed. "A recording? In this state, a daughter's recording of a private conversation won't hold up in court. Julian is going to prison for kidnapping and coercion, and there's nothing you can do." But Ivy had a second, unique card to play. "Maybe the recording won't stick, but the paper trail will. I found the ledger, Father. Not the one you showed Julian, the real one. The one you kept in the safe at our old house. I know you didn't just skim the funds, you framed Julian's father for the wiring fault. You paid the inspector to lie." The air in the cabin turned tragic and cold. Arthur's face paled. "You wouldn't. If you give that to the feds, I'll die in prison." "Then give me the confession," Ivy whispered, her eyes filled with fascinating tears. "Tell the truth about the marriage. Tell them it was a mutual agreement. Tell them you were the one who suggested the trade. If you don't, I walk into the FBI office at dawn with the ledger. I am choosing Julian. I am choosing the truth over the blood money." The final reckoning was a battle of wills. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Finally, the shadow of the rivalry broke. Arthur St. Clair, the man who had traded his daughter to save his skin, slumped into his chair. He was a hollow man, defeated by the very integrity he had tried to crush in his daughter. "Fine," Arthur rasped. "Give me the phone." Ivy, standing in the rain outside the lodge, clutching the recorded confession that would clear Julian's name. She had committed the ultimate betrayal against her own blood to save the man who had become her soul. The debt was finally being paid, not with money, but with the truth. Chapter 11, The Healing. The legal machinery moved with a realistic and grinding slowness, but once Ivy delivered the ledger and the confession to the U.S. Attorney's office, the narrative shifted with the force of an earthquake. The victim had become the hero, and the ruthless billionaire was revealed as a man who had been sabotaged by a ghost from his past. 2 weeks later, the gates of the Metropolitan Detention Center opened. Julian walked out into a cold, crisp morning. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a simple black hoodie, his face shadowed by a week's worth of stubble. He looked tragic and tired, but the moment his eyes found Ivy waiting by the SUV, the captivating intensity returned. They didn't speak for a long time. They simply held each other in the middle of the sidewalk, the suspense of the trial replaced by the heavy, grounding weight of being together. "You should have let me go to prison," Julian whispered into her hair, his voice a low, broken rasp. "You destroyed your family for me." "I destroyed a lie, Julian," Ivy replied, pulling back to look him in the eye. "My father chose his path 20 years ago. I just stopped walking it with him." The healing began in the basalt house on the cliff. It was no longer a lion's den or a gilded cage. Julian had officially stepped down from Vane Global, the scandal having made his position as chairman untenable, unique sacrifice he made without a single regret. He was no longer the shark of Wall Street, he was just a man with a vast, quiet estate and a soul that was finally starting to breathe. The conflict now was learning how to live without a contract. For the first few days, they moved around each other with a fascinating uncertainty. There were no schedules, no rules, and no debt to settle. "What do we do now?" Ivy asked one evening as they sat on the deck, watching the moon reflect off the Atlantic. "The world still thinks we're a scandal. Your company is in transition, and my father is gone." Julian reached out, taking her hand and lacing their fingers together. "We do what we should have done from the start. We build something that isn't based on revenge. I've started the process of liquidating the Cayman's account. Every cent of it is going into a foundation for the families of the dock fire victims. My father's name will finally be cleared, not by a lawsuit, but by the truth. And us?" Julian turned to her, the fire in his eyes now a warm, steady softness. "There is no more contract, Ivy. You can go anywhere in the world. But I'm hoping you'll stay here. Not as a St. Clair, and not as a Vane. Just as you." The twist was the simplicity of their new reality. The ruthless billionaire had lost his empire, and the debt bride had lost her inheritance, yet they had never felt richer. They spent the weeks gardening, cooking together in the massive kitchen that once felt so cold, and talking until the sun came up. The tragic history that had bound them together was finally being overwritten by a captivating present. The chapter ends with Julian taking the original, signed marriage contract. The one that had started this entire journey, and tossing it into the fireplace. They watched the bill of sale curl into black ash, the smoke rising into the chimney and disappearing into the night. "The debt is settled," Julian said, pulling her into his lap. "No," Ivy whispered, kissing him with a realistic and deep passion. "The debt is gone. This is just love." Chapter 12, The Happily Ever After. 1 year later, the basalt estate on the cliff no longer looked like a cold fortress. The floor-to-ceiling glass was smudged with fingerprints of life, and the once silent halls were filled with the captivating melody of jazz and the smell of salt air and home-cooked meals. Julian and Ivy stood in the garden they had planted together, overlooking the Atlantic. This was the beautiful American wedding the world never thought they'd see. There were no flashbulbs, no rival socialites, and no hidden agendas. It was a simple ceremony under an arch of white roses and driftwood, attended only by the people who had stood by them during the tragic fallout of the year before. Julian looked at Ivy, and the ruthless billionaire was nowhere to be found. In his place was a man whose eyes held a unique and steady peace. He was no longer running an empire of shipping lanes, he was running a global nonprofit dedicated to industrial safety and victim advocacy, a legacy built from the ashes of his own past. "A year ago, I handed you a contract," Julian said, his voice a low, emotional rasp as he held both of Ivy's hands. "I thought I could control the world by owning a piece of it. I thought I could heal my heart by hurting yours. I was wrong. You didn't just pay a debt, Ivy, you taught me that the only thing worth owning is a future where I can wake up next to you." Ivy smiled, a realistic and radiant expression of joy. She had grown misty. Claire Foundation into a beacon of hope for struggling families, turning her family's tragic name into a symbol of restitution. "I signed that paper to save a man who didn't deserve it," Ivy replied, her voice clear and fascinating in its strength. "But I stayed because I found a man who did. We started with a debt, Julian, but we ended with a choice. And I choose you, every single day, without a contract and without a doubt." As they exchanged rings. Simple bands of gold with no stones, representing a bond that didn't need to show off, the climax of their lives felt like a distant memory. They were no longer the souled daughter and the ruthless rival. They were just Julian and Ivy, two people who had survived the fire and come out stronger on the other side. The resolution was absolute. Arthur St. Claire remained in a minimum security facility, finally facing the realistic consequences of his greed, but he and Ivy had reached a quiet, distant peace. The Vane St. Claire war was over. The debt was not just settled, it was forgiven. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Atlantic in bruised purples and brilliant golds, Julian pulled Ivy close for their first dance as husband and wife, not for a public charade, but for themselves. The hidden softness was now their greatest strength. Thank you so much for listening to the final chapter of Traded to the Ruthless Billionaire, My Debt Marriage Contract. We hope Julian and Ivy's journey from a cold transaction to a captivating and realistic love has moved you as much as it moved us. This story reminds us that even when we are traded like property, our souls remain our own, and hope can be found in the most unique and tragic circumstances. Now, we want to hear from you. Did you expect Julian to sacrifice his chairmanship to save Ivy? What was your favorite twist in their journey? Drop a comment below and let's discuss the ending. If you enjoyed this romance audiobook, please like this video, share it with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode of our latest high-stakes tales. Until the next story, remember. Love isn't a debt to be paid, it's a gift to be given.